Season 5, Episode 14 of Breaking Bad, Ozymandias, is generally regarded as not only one of the greatest episodes of American television, but the darkest episode of the entire series. The culmination of all of Walter White's bad decisions, narcissism, and moral disregard that's built up over the course of 5 seasons. But what is the darkest episode of the prequel/spin-off series, Better Call Saul? Some contenders do come to mind, like Chicanery, Lantern, Winner, 5-0, even Pimento, but I don't think any of these can truly compete with not one, not two, but the 3 final episodes of the Better Call Saul timeline. And I don't mean the very last 4 episodes taking place in the post-Breaking Bad Gene Takovic timeline. I'm talking about Episode 7, Plan and Execution, Episode 8, Point and Shoot, and Episode 9, Fun and Games. At first I was only considering the singular darkest episode of the series, which to me is Episode 9, Fun and Games, but then I realized that the supreme tragedy of Fun and Games only succeeds due to the previous horror of Point and Shoot and the previous dark comedy of Plan and Execution. In my opinion, these 3 episodes form a trilogy of masterful and emotional storytelling, a nearly 3-hour-long narrative that's often just as difficult to get through as Breaking Bad's Ozymandias. I dare say these 3 episodes are some of the best that television has to offer as a serious art form, but not because each episode is a continual shock to the senses as we see our characters and their goals dramatically unravel as we do in Ozymandias, but because these 3 episodes tend to mix their genres, which really places us as viewers even more on edge. We don't know whether to laugh, cringe, scream, or cry, or do all of them at once. Plan and Execution primarily utilizes a comedic plot structure, with its shocking ending bleeding into, pun not intended, the horror plot structure of Point and Shoot, which then leads us into the tragic plot structure of Fun and Games, capping off the prequel timeline and fully being in the circumstances of the Breaking Bad timeline. So let's explore these plot structures. I'll be doing this video essay in parts to make the analysis more digestible and easier to follow, but I will compile all the parts together in a supercut afterwards. We'll be exploring each episode's respective plot structure, and how both the adherence to and violation of these structures connect each episode narratively and thematically, and how the trilogy as a whole connects to the overarching tragic transformation of Jimmy McGill that we all knew was coming, only we didn't expect to get there in this exact way. Better Call Saul has always been leading to the tragedy of a protagonist searching for love and self-acceptance, only to find it in the wrong moral places. The show was good at making us forget we were always in a tragedy, especially with the mixing of genres in this final trilogy. This is the comedy, horror, and tragedy of Better Call Saul's final episodes. If it's your first time here, my name is Quentin. I'm a writer, teacher, and sometimes performer. It's time yet again to analyze the complex characters and precise artistry of this amazing series. I'm assuming if you clicked on this video essay, then you're familiar with the premise of the show, so I don't need to summarize anything, unlike in my previous video essays. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to keep up with this 3-part video essay. So let's get into today's analysis, the dark comedy of Better Call Saul's Plan and Execution. So what even is a plot structure? Every narrative, whether book, film, TV show, and in some cases songs, follows a progression from beginning to middle to end. You may have heard of the hero's journey and how that particular plot structure has been utilized again and again, such as in Star Wars, Harry Potter, and even Bo Burnham's pandemic film Inside, which, fun fact, I wrote my master's thesis on. I'll link it in the description if anyone's interested. One of the reasons certain stories resonate and others fall flat is because of the adherence to basic, universal plot structures that reflect our internal inclination towards looking at our lives and the world through a narrative lens. In Christopher Booker's text, The 7 Basic Plots, he outlines 7 different structures which the vast majority of our collective narratives, at least in Western culture, utilize. These consist of comedy, overcoming the monster, tragedy, rags to riches, voyage and return, rebirth, and the quest, as well as the hero's journey, with this one being the overarching template for these 7 specific plots. Basically, a plot structure is the series of progressive points a narrative fulfills to tell a clear and satisfying story, typically ending with the protagonist having changed in some way from their experiences. Now, where it gets really interesting is when narratives violate basic plot structures, primarily by combining different genres into one one singular narrative, and thereby mixing different plot beats, keeping the audience on the edge of their seats. That rhymes. And this is exactly what these 3 episodes in Better Call Saul accomplish. So let's look at the comedic plot structure of Season 6, Episode 7, Plan and Execution. We'll be using Christopher Booker's text as a guide. Let's get into it. In terms of the basic thematic elements inherent in all comedies, it would be the violation of expectations and an overall state of confusion/miscommunication for the characters involved, typically ending in some kind of union between characters, especially marriage, or between characters and their environment. That's typically what makes comedic stories funny in a general sense. Though not all comedies are laugh-out-loud funny. Some are more satirical, some are cleverer, and some are darker. Here are the basic plot points for a comedy plot structure, as outlined by Christopher Booker. The shadow of confusion. Quote, "We're introduced to the hero and heroine, who are clearly marked as destined to be together, but they're being separated. There's confusion, miscommunication, and frustration, and the designated couples aren't hooking up." End quote. It gets worse. Quote, "The confusion previously mentioned gets even more convoluted. The darkness separating everyone is at its thickest, and the tension for the characters is at its peak. Things are going disastrously for our hero and heroine." End quote. And I would add, often for other characters as well. The confusion is lifted. Quote, "Someone or something explains the misunderstandings. All the characters breathe collective sighs of relief, weddings are arranged, and the villain is either punished or repents in time for the engagement party." End quote. An important aspect of plot structures to remember is that these plot points never look precisely the same, which is why we will never quite run out of stories to tell. The content is always changing, while the form typically remains the same in terms of the construction of the story. So now, let's explore the dark comedic structure of Plan and Execution. I'm definitely not saying that the episode is a laugh-out-loud funny comedy, but rather it follows the structure of a comedy with some appropriate humor in its opening and progressively becomes darker, casting it overall as a dark comedy. One of the striking things about this episode and its comedic structure is that the opening shot features a shadowy figure emerging from the sewer. Right away, we are cast in a literal shadow of confusion. Who is this figure? Why are they casually emerging from a sewer? And we pretty quickly deduce that it's Lalo Salamanca, our main villain who will appear as an impending threat closing in on Jimmy, Kim, Gus, and Mike, independent of the comedic main plot that concerns Jimmy and Kim's final play of the Howard scam. Lalo's presence in this episode foreshadows the horror plot structure we'll encounter in the next episode. The confusion for us as the audience continues when we're suddenly following Lenny, one of Jimmy's uninformed conspirators who really just wants to be an actor. I can relate. Really astute viewers may recognize him from an earlier episode, but it's still not clear right away who this character is, until Jimmy pulls up in a rush. Although Jimmy and Kim are already technically in a legal union as husband and wife, one of the main reasons Kim initiates the scam is to reconnect with Jimmy after the trauma of their encounter with Lalo, utilizing the scam as an opportunity to reignite their love, mess with the man she's gradually been disliking throughout the series, and get their share of the Sandpiper money earlier. Overall though, Jimmy and Kim commit the Howard scam because it's something that brings them together in a very dark, immoral way. But, with Casimiro having a broken arm, their final play is not going according to plan. There is uncertainty over whether they can recreate the photos needed for the final play in time. We as viewers are not completely certain what the final play entails, due to the intentional withholding of some of the specifics of the plan. We feel just as uncertain as Jimmy and Kim about how this is actually going to turn out. There's a franticness to this opening scene of Jimmy, Kim, and the UNM film students trying to redo these photos. Any scene involving the UNM crew is always humorous. The earnestness of the makeup girl, the dry pretentiousness of the camera guy, and the awkwardness of the sound guy make for some great back and forth with Jimmy and Kim. As they try to rush through Lenny's wardrobe and makeup, the camera spins in a circular motion, combined with music that personally reminds me a lot of the soundtrack of Birdman, a comedy film itself. A dark comedy film, actually, making the whole situation even more frantic and absurd, along with some overlapping dialogue, giving the scene a looser feel compared to other scenes we've encountered in the series. As the camera guy instructs his quote-unquote class in the opening,
"Don't get lost in the circle of confusion,"
a clear foreshadowing to the circular shot and the comedic plot point of the shadow of confusion the characters and us as the audience are experiencing. What does this final play exactly entail? Will this final play work? Will Jimmy and Kim succeed in reconnecting over their scam? As is typical of comedies, the confusion gets worse. We see Jimmy pass off the stage photos to Howard's private investigator? What? I will never forget my original shock when this was revealed. The confusion continues to get worse once we shift to Howard's perspective. He wonders why Jen Endowski is seeing him now with an update on following Jimmy. And why exactly are the photos wet? And why is Howard suddenly feeling hot with his heart racing so rapidly? And then, bam, Casimiro walks in, broken arm and all. We start to understand the final play Jimmy and Kim were planning all along, and why it was so important to recreate these photos to show Howard before the mediation. And just as we think we fully understand what the final play always was, we're hit again with a bit of a violation of our expectations. Rather than the stage photos not being there in his office, they've been switched. Howard, despite his intoxicated state, does manage to piece together the entirety of the scam against him, and with the final play a success, Sandpiper does settle, and the confusion/uncertainty is lifted for all of the characters, and for us as the audience, mostly. Jimmy and Kim reconnected emotionally, financially, and, physically. Happy ending to a comedic structure, right? Not exactly. Like Howard, we're still left somewhat confused by Jimmy and Kim's true overarching motivation for this scam. We understand the how, but not exactly the why. Upon repeat viewings of Better Call Saul, we can ascertain it a bit better, but initially it's not so obvious. Jimmy and Kim's primary targets for their scams in the past have usually been unsympathetic strangers or the legal system in general. I guess you could say Chuck was a target of their scamming, though that was primarily led by Jimmy. This time, Kim is leading the scam against Howard while Jimmy goes along reluctantly, but even then, Jimmy laid the groundwork by harassing Howard in Season 5. This time their scamming, while important and justifiable to them, has a darker edge, since Howard really is the last person who deserves to be fucked with. But it wasn't truly about any hatred towards Howard. The more Howard expresses his anger and disappointment, the more he realizes,
you're perfect for each other. You have a piece missing.
Indeed, they individually have pieces missing, and this scam was a means of fulfilling that missing piece to their relationship, the thrill of the con. Now the confusion is totally lifted. Although both having some dislike of Howard and desire for money, the overarching motivation was because they enjoyed doing it together. And now they have. So why doesn't Howard's passive-aggressive offering of Macallan whiskey feel more celebratory for them? Well, we've been in a dark comedy plot overall, watching this couple reconnect at the expense of a character who never did anything bad enough to justify their character assassination. And despite the confusion being lifted and Jimmy and Kim further cementing a future together, especially with that Sandpiper money, the darkness is about to completely overtake the structure. Lalo has entered the building, shooting Howard in the head and fully pulling us into the horror plot structure of Season 6, Episode 8, Point and Shoot. The happy ending and sigh of relief of a typical comedy is replaced by the unexpected necessity of overcoming the monster. So let's look at the horror plot structure of Season 6, Episode 8, Point and Shoot. The horror genre tends to utilize a plot structure known specifically as overcoming the monster. Horror stories generally feature some kind of threat, a literal monster, a supernatural force, a murderer, or even family members, that characters either manage to overcome or fail to overcome. Just like with comedies, there is variation in the content of these stories, but they generally tend to follow the same progression in their plot structures. Not all horror stories are violent, graphic, and full of jump scares. If anything, the most effective horror stories are ones that build an unnerving atmosphere, complemented by an imposing threat. It's not about graphic violence or pure shock, it's about the fear of the threat and the fear that our characters may not be able to overcome the threat. As outlined by Christopher Booker, the typical structure for an overcoming the monster narrative consists of anticipation and the call. Quote, the hero learns about the monster from afar, including its powers and reign of terror over the nearby community, and the hero accepts the call to defeat the monster. End quote. Dream stage. Quote, the hero prepares to fight the monster while it is still a comfortable distance away, although the distance between the two is decreasing. End quote. Frustration stage. Quote, it's here, the monster, and it's even worse than we thought. The monster's power is revealed in all its terrible glory, and it looks like our hero is in way over his or her head. End quote. Nightmare stage. Quote, cue the epic battle music, because it is on. And it's not going well for our hero, who is being absolutely pummeled by the monster. But wait, just as all hope is lost, the major chords start peeking through on the background score, because the tide of the battle is about to turn. End quote. Death of the monster. Quote, the monster is defeated, hero emerges victorious, and the grateful people present him/her with treasure, a kingdom, or something to rule over. End quote. With these plot points in mind, let's now explore the structure of Better Call Saul's point and shoot, and how it both adheres to and violates this typical structure. In the opening teaser to the preceding episode, Plan and Execution, Lalo Salamanca's shadowy, creepy presence as he spies on the laundromat from the sewer foreshadows this very structure, especially in its lighting and compositions. In fact, the vast majority of point and shoot is filmed in heavy darkness, with shadowy silhouettes, and a general atmosphere of dread and tension. And with a ton of handheld cinematography, not typical for the style of the series, but more in line with the cinematography of not only Breaking Bad, but also horror films, especially slashers. Some of the choices in shot compositions, like this one of Lalo standing over Jimmy and Kim, remind me of slasher film compositions, like a lanky Jason Voorhees holding a weapon before going in for a kill, though he never uses a gun in any of those movies. Lalo is no doubt the monster closing in on Jimmy, Kim, Mike, and Gus, with his unexpected arrival and murder of Howard placing us firmly in a horror plot. Although Lalo, surviving the assassination attempt at the end of Season 5 and trying to uncover evidence of Gus Fring's plot against the cartel, has been gradually closing in throughout all of the previous episodes, not just Episode 7. And that's one of the interesting things about the mixing of plot structures in these 3 episodes. The first 2 stages of the overcoming the monster structure have already been accentuated before Lalo's murder of Howard. In Season 6, Episode 2, Carrot and Stick, with a smug look on Hector Salamanca's face, Gus is able to deduce that Lalo is indeed alive, thinking the assassination was successful, and thinking he can focus on his next move with Nacho. Gus is shocked by the realization that Lalo is still out there. Now Gus anticipates that Lalo will come after him, so he starts the preparation for a final defeat. Gus accepts the call to finish him once and for all, hopefully. In Season 6, Episode 4, Hit and Run, and Episode 5, Black and Blue, we see Gus in the dream stage, having a connecting tunnel between his house and a safe house, having a body double, and preparing for the possibility that Lalo will discover the underground lab construction by setting up an opportunity to disconnect the lights and hiding a gun. Lalo is still a comfortable distance away, in Germany, yet he is closer than ever to finding the proof of Gus's plan, and thus the distance between the monster and our hero is decreasing. Then we reach the frustration stage, as signaled by Lalo's arrival and subsequent murder of Howard at the end of Plan and Execution. We may have abandoned the overcoming the monster plot progression of earlier episodes in order to be planted in the comedic structure of Episode 7, but even so, the threat of Lalo was playing in the background. And now we've reached this frustration stage and are fully planted in the horror of point and shoot, rather than staying in the dark comedy of Plan and Execution. Not only are Jimmy and Kim indirectly responsible for Howard getting killed by Lalo, but now he insists that one of them go to Gus's house and attempt to shoot him as a diversion. Jimmy insists Kim does it so she won't be left alone with Lalo, obviously. Jimmy and Kim knew Lalo was dangerous, but they never could have envisioned the monster would just turn up at the apartment like that and murder a former colleague in cold blood. Jimmy is tied up and gagged, left alone with Howard's dead body, while Lalo infiltrates the laundromat undetected. This monster is bigger and badder than we thought. Lalo has even managed to outsmart 2 cool and calculated characters like Gus and Mike, allowing him to enter the building he's had his eye on since returning from Germany. As many like to say, Lalo is built differently. Indeed he is. Now we come to the nightmare stage. Gus, having heard from Kim that Jimmy managed to talk Lalo into sending her, suspects that something else is afoot. And sure enough, Gus is correct. Lalo emerges from the darkness, shooting Gus's only men with him and now having him cornered. He is indeed like a slasher movie killer, evading the eyes of others, laying out coordinated traps, and leaving a path of death and destruction everywhere he goes. What does the monster want more than anything in this episode? He wants proof that Gus is attempting to betray the cartel and become the drug kingpin through building a super lab. He starts filming Gus, forcing him at gunpoint to show him the underground construction. The handheld footage of Gus at gunpoint could be viewed as a slight homage to found footage horror films like The Blair Witch Project or even Paranormal Activity, another indication of the influence of the horror genre on this episode. There's no immediate escape for Gus, it's now or never. Either the monster succeeds or the monster is defeated, though some of the suspense is a bit undercut by the prequel nature of the series. Unless you're starting with Better Call Saul, the vast majority of viewers know Gus will get out of this situation alive. But still, will Gus be the one to finally defeat Lalo? Indeed, he is the one. We enter the death of the monster. Gus, managing to distract Lalo with his rant against all of the cartel, shifts over to the light cord, disconnects it, grabs his hidden gun, and points and shoots. Not at Lalo directly, but where he thinks Lalo might be within the darkness. The look of fear on Gus's face always sticks with me. He keeps pressing the trigger even after clearly being out of ammunition. That's how terrified he is of Lalo deep down. He has to be sure Lalo has been overcome, switching back on the lights and seeing him gagging on his own blood. He smiles one last time, as if conceding to Gus evading him for good this time, almost a mirroring of Howard conceding to Jimmy and Kim and their successful scam. Gus, as the hero, vanquished the monster. But similar to the comedic structure of episode 7, there is no victory celebration. Gus is not bestowed with any prizes or riches. In fact, no one is celebrating the demise of the monster who has infiltrated and damaged all of our characters' plans. Instead, the sun starts to rise, the light returns, and the bodies must be dealt with. This also reminds me of a typical ending to a slasher film. The killer may be defeated, but the damage remains. The cavalry comes in to deal with the death left behind. Jimmy and Kim now have to double down on the Howard fiction to cover up his murder, and thereby cover up the cartel. And just like the incomplete final point of the comedic structure in plan and execution, the monster's defeat transitions us into the tragic plot structure of fun and games, rather than the typical celebration of the monster's demise. We see Lalo and Howard buried together under the lab, with Mike looking pretty remorseful about Howard's undeserved fate. Gus's drug empire was literally built off of the blood of enemies and innocent bystanders. The scam was successful, the monster was defeated, but the tragic consequences for our characters have just begun. Let's look at the tragedy plot structure of Season 6, Episode 9, Fun and Games. Not to be too much of a downer, but I think it's safe to say that all of us have experienced a personal or collective tragedy before. Remember that pandemic we just had? Or we've all at least witnessed someone go through a tragedy. According to Christopher Booker, comedy and tragedy are the most recognizable plot structures out of the major 7, probably because universally, we all laugh and we all cry. Generally, tragic stories involve the downfall or destruction of a protagonist or a group of characters, often resulting in death, whether a literal death or a metaphorical death due to circumstances, mistakes, or individual flaws. While Breaking Bad most certainly has tragic elements throughout, it's more of a fast-paced crime drama, whereas Better Call Saul is a character-driven tragedy with crime drama and comedic elements all throughout. The tragedy of Jimmy McGill's transformation into Saul Goodman is complete by this final episode in the prequel timeline, along with tragic transformations for our other characters as well, like Kim, Mike, and Gus. Fun and Games is the tragic climax of not only the series as a whole, but of course the 3-episode trilogy we've been exploring, with the Gene Takovic episodes serving as a denouement for both Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. We'll come back to the narrative/thematic connections between these 3 episodes and Jimmy's overall transformation into Saul Goodman. Now let's get into the typical stages of a tragic plot, as outlined by Christopher Booker. Many of them are actually the same in structure to overcoming the monster, but with very different circumstances. First, we have the anticipation stage. Quote, "The tragic hero gets it into his or her head that something is missing, and they want it. This might be power, fame, a specific love interest, or something else, but the protagonist has their motivation for the disaster dominoes that are about to fall. We call that object of desire a MacGuffin," end quote. MacGuffin being a Hitchcockian term, meaning something that motivates the characters, but doesn't carry a lot of relevance to the overall plot in general. Dream stage. Quote, the tragic hero sets out on their path to obtain their MacGuffin. Something occurs that tells the reader, or the viewer, that this is a no turning back situation, and things start to go strangely well for the protagonist. He or she might well be on their way down the path of evil, but no one is calling them out on it, or no one can stop them, so they proceed further into the depths. End quote. Frustration stage. Quote, right about here is where the tragic hero hits their first roadblocks. They might be small annoyances, but in dealing with them, the protagonist commits additional dark acts that seal their fate and alerts the reader or viewer that the only way this can end is badly. End quote. Nightmare stage. Quote, the tragic hero's plan is unraveling, and they can sense that an opposing force or fate is closing in. He or she is increasingly paranoid and living in fear of what's to come. End quote. Destruction or death stage. Quote, our protagonist breathes their last breath, whether at the hands of their enemies or due to some final act of violence. Either way, their death isn't mourned much, and the darkness that surrounded them dissipates, and there is much rejoicing. End quote. Similar to the overcoming the monster structure of point and shoot, the first few points in the tragedy plot structure are already established in previous episodes in Season 6, well before the events of Fun and Games. Though like point and shoot and its structure, Fun and Games is the epitome and total fulfillment of the tragedy structure, where everything established throughout the season and throughout the prequel timeline meets a tragic end. So let's look at Season 6, Episode 9 through the tragedy plot structure. I will make some reference to Mike and Gus's tragic circumstances in this analysis, since they have their own equally compelling arcs prior to the Breaking Bad timeline, but the central focus of the series, and these 3 episodes, have always been on Jimmy McGill's transformation into Saul Goodman. We begin this analysis with the anticipation stage. In Season 5, Episode 10, Something Unforgivable, knowing that Jimmy is still unsettled by Lalo confronting him at Kim's apartment, and sensing their relationship is on thin ice, Kim proposes an elaborate scam against Howard Hamlin, a character they both have a complicated history with, and someone who could be useful as a pawn to make the Sandpiper Crossing case settle quicker. With the fact that their connection stems from the love of the con, Kim therefore sees this character assassination plot primarily as a way to reconnect, though they tell themselves they're doing it for a greater good, forcing an early settlement for their benefit and the benefit of the Sandpiper Crossing residents. This is their MacGuffin, to reconnect romantically and distract themselves through the fun and games of an elaborate scam. In a really messed up way, their overarching desire is to stay together, even if it means Howard's reputation gets ruined. In episodes 1, 2, 3, and 4, Jimmy and Kim are truly in the dream stage. Every single step in their con is going according to plan. Cliff sees fake drugs fall out of Howard's locker in Wine and Roses. Jimmy manipulates the Kettlemans into accusing Howard of being on drugs to Cliff in Carrot and Stick. Huel and another accomplice make a copy of Howard's car key in Rock and Hard Place, and Cliff witnesses Jimmy, dressed as Howard, throw a sex worker out of his car in Hit and Run. Even Howard is reacting the way they planned, hiring a fake private investigator to follow Jimmy in episode 5, Black and Blue. Everything is going crazily well, even when Jimmy has to use all of his strength to move a parking sign outside Howard's therapist's office, or when Huel starts questioning the necessity for this elaborate scam. We reach the frustration stage by episode 4, when Mike reveals to Kim that Lalo Salamanca is still alive, and thus Jimmy and her are being watched by Gus Fring's men, just in case Lalo makes contact. Kim knows that if Jimmy finds out, he'll want to stop the scam, so she keeps it from him in order to keep pursuing their MacGuffin, reconnecting by scamming together, a reasoning she reveals in Fun and Games. Later frustration occurs when Kim is presented with the option of stopping the final play of the scam due to Casimiro's broken arm and continuing on to Santa Fe, for a meeting that could bring her legal dreams to life in episode 6, Axe and Grind. But of course, she chooses the Howard scam, a bad choice that will seal the fates of herself, Jimmy, and Howard. And this is where the comedy structure of plan and execution kicks in, although as we know, it doesn't complete its final point. Instead, we're placed in the overcoming the monster structure with the horror of point and shoot. It's really interesting how we go in and out of different plot structures simultaneously throughout the season. The impending tragedy of Jimmy and Kim's scam, with some dark comedic plot points, combined with the impending horror of Lalo Salamanca. 3 different structures operating at the same time, and each one reaching their peak within this trilogy of episodes. Reaching the nightmare stage in the tragedy structure, Jimmy and Kim fulfill their scam by episode 7, and Lalo is defeated by episode 8. But the murder of Howard is an unexpected consequence that they now have to deal with. And this, I believe, is the tragic stage where episode 9 begins. Our opening montage, set to a cover of Perfect Day, originally by Harry Nielsen, is beautifully done, but incredibly haunting and tragic. It almost brings me to tears every time I see it. The contrast between Jimmy and Kim going about their days as if they aren't indirectly responsible for someone's death because of their immoral desires, while Mike and the rest of the crew cover up this death, is a nightmare to say the very least. As humans living in this modern age, I'm sure we've all had the experience of having something troubling on our minds while being forced to behave like a functional person in the world. On a personal note, I even had a bit of trouble completing this final script because I'm a bit distracted by some stressful things going on in my life, though nothing on the same level of what Jimmy and Kim are thinking about during this quote-unquote perfect day. Another detail to note if we look at color theory is that Jimmy and Kim both wear blue, a color associated with the legal world as well as ideals of safety and stability. I think this presents a bit of a double meaning. They're trying to blend into the legal surroundings in spite of their criminal actions, and they're about to be safe and stable because of the cover-up being orchestrated. Physically safe and stable, that is. They are both very far from being emotionally safe and stable. The final lyric and shot compositions as they come back to their apartment very much reflect back on their MacGuffin, quote, "to say I love you," end quote. They did this scam primarily because that's how they romantically connect. They never say I love you throughout the series, but rather express their love through mutual love of an activity rather than through words. But now, there's no doubt they both have blood on their hands. It's even worse for Kim, since she chose to withhold vital information about Lalo from Jimmy. Jimmy, in his avoidant way, can do some minor mental gymnastics to rationalize that it was Lalo who killed Howard. How could they have known he was still alive and would show up like that? Lalo's murder of Howard as an opposing force to their plans has planted them back into the tragic circumstances they've been heading towards, being forced to double down on Howard being an unstable drug-addicted lawyer in order to protect themselves from the wrath of the cartel. Kim and Jimmy have to lie straight to Cheryl Hamlin's face. The guilt of knowing full well what really happened and being indirectly responsible for it is truly a living nightmare, one which Kim, more than Jimmy, would like to escape from, as epitomized by this tender, sad kiss directly under an electric light source. Electric lights being placed near Jimmy throughout the show to represent his morally flexible attitude towards the law. Kim, having morally declined slower than Jimmy has now experienced what her moral flexibility can result in, the undeserved death of another human being. And now we come to the final stage in a tragedy. Destruction or death. Not only have we reached the metaphorical death of Jimmy and Kim as a couple and as individuals, but Gus and Mike are somewhat dead inside after everything. It's tragic for Mike as he realizes after talking to Manuel Varga about Nacho that he's just as bad as the people he works for. Despite his attempts to maintain some moral code and justice in the face of criminal activity, Mike has failed. Mike is down in the gutter with the rest of these gangsters. Gus, despite getting a chance to relax a bit and let his guard down, realizes he can never have a normal life, as demonstrated by abruptly leaving his flirtatious interaction with a man at the bar. Now, you could interpret this moment either as Gus realizing this, or him sadly being unable to get his revenge on the Salamancas out of his mind, even for one night. I personally interpret it as the former, but no matter how you interpret it, this is another tragic moment in a very tragic episode. Then we reach the metaphorical deaths of Jimmy and Kim. Resigning as a lawyer and ready to face the reality that her and Jimmy are, in her words, poisoned together, Kim ends their relationship once and for all. It's the first time we ever hear them say,
"I love you." I love you too.
But for Kim, it doesn't matter. As she says, other people suffer because of them. Jimmy, trying to stop the destruction of their relationship, rationalizes again how Lalo was the one who killed Howard. But Kim puts that to rest by revealing she knew Lalo was still out there, but was having too much fun reconnecting with Jimmy to tell the truth. Jimmy would not only not have taken it well, but he would have stopped the Howard scam from continuing, and then they would have ended their relationship. Their plan was successful, but it resulted in unintended tragedy. Kim's life as a lawyer in Albuquerque is dead, and so is Jimmy. the camera closing in on his back not only to visualize Kim turning her back on him, but Jimmy turning his back on whatever semblance was left of himself. Then, we cut to Saul Goodman's morning routine. In a way, we come full circle in this trilogy of 7, 8, and 9. This scene has some signature Saul Goodman humor, straight out of Breaking Bad, but the context is tragic, thus we find ourselves again as we did in the beginning, in a dark comedy. Saul's trademark snappy and jester-like demeanor now has a darker edge, knowing the events that gradually created everyone's favorite criminal lawyer. But still, the prevailing feeling and structure of this entire episode is tragedy with a capital T. Jimmy McGill, as we have known him, is dead. Now, we better call Saul. So how are the structures of these episodes connected narratively and thematically to each other, and to the transformation of Jimmy McGill into Saul Goodman? I've touched on it a bit already, but let's summarize it completely. For starters, each episode's opening teaser hints at the incoming plot structure of the next episode. Lalo spying on the laundromat in the opening of episode 7 hints at the horror in episode 8. Howard's car settled on the beach in the opening of episode 8 hints at the final tragedy in episode 9. And the opening montage to episode 9 is just straight up haunting tragedy. It's clear how the dark comedy of the final play of the Howard scam transitions into the horror of Mike and Gus trying to overcome Lalo, which finally ends with the tragic results of the scam and seeing how it was the final catalyst in Jimmy embodying Saul Goodman. You can see how all of the plot structures in this trilogy are interconnected narratively through their adherence to long established narrative structures, with each structure hinting at the other in their openings and leading into each other organically, with crucial plot stages even established in earlier episodes. Yet two of them never reach their final structural point. Jimmy and Kim never further their union as you typically see in comedic narratives, and Lalo's defeat is never truly celebrated, but rather covered up, unlike in typical overcoming the monster narratives. The only plot structure within this trilogy that reaches its final point is the tragedy plot structure. Jimmy McGill is dead while Saul Goodman lives. So while the adherence to these structures kept this trilogy narratively together and narratively coherent, the violation of these plot structures, never reaching the final endpoints in comedy nor in horror, but reaching the final endpoint in tragedy, connect them thematically. One of the central themes of both Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul being that actions can have unintended consequences. And this most certainly applies to this trilogy. Jimmy and Kim's dark comedic union wouldn't have been interrupted by the horror of Lalo, and Howard wouldn't have been tragically killed if different actions had been taken on both sides. We never get to celebrate Jimmy and Kim reconnecting, nor breathe a sigh of relief that Lalo is dead, but we do see Jimmy go full Saul, which was always on the horizon in this series. Tragedy is the only completed plot structure because we've always been watching a tragic story unfold. Yet throughout 63 episodes, there were many moments of comedy, moments of disturbing drama bordering on psychological horror, and of course moments of tragedy. As I said in the first part of this video essay, in my opinion, Better Call Saul excelled at making us forget we were always heading towards a tragic transformation. I remember watching the first season and thinking, wow, this show is way more lighthearted than Breaking Bad. And then I was aghast at the revelation that Jimmy's own brother was working against him, and suddenly I thought I knew where the series would lead, but I was never totally right with my predictions. Better Call Saul was always leading to the tragedy of a protagonist searching for love and self-acceptance, only to find it in the wrong moral places. The narrative mixing in this trilogy and the series in general often kept us engaged and distracted from what was coming. We thought watching Saul Goodman from Breaking Bad become Saul Goodman from Breaking Bad would be all fun and games.
Because I was having too much fun!
But it was more than we bargained for, and that was the comedy, horror, and tragedy of Better Call Saul. Thank you so much for watching. My Patreon is linked below if you want to support me in making these videos, and get some perks. Or hey, why not throw me a tip by clicking on the 3 dots below? Or become a member of the channel. You can earn some badges and get early access to videos like this one. Any amount you can afford helps a lot. Thank you. A special shout out to our newest channel member, Beatrice Paz. Great to have you, and thanks for the support. Also, let's not forget Vermilion Star, our very first channel member. Thank you once again. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. See you soon.